They tried to slow him down. They tried to manage him. They tried to control the timeline, control the narrative, control exactly how much of him the world was allowed to see. And for a while it looked like it was working. But you cannot contain what is real. You cannot hold back what is meant to be. And inside the Cleveland Browns facility, behind the closed doors and the careful press conference language and the depth chart decisions that were supposed to tell one story, another story was being written. A story that nobody in that building could stop. A story that the player himself was writing, one rep at a time, one throw at a time, one moment at a time. They tried to hold him back. He took over anyway. And now the entire NFL is talking about what is happening in Cleveland. There is a moment in every great quarterback story where the plan falls apart. Not the quarterback's plan, the organization's plan. The careful, measured, professionally constructed plan about how this player will be introduced to professional football, about how much time he will need, about what the timeline looks like and who controls it, and how the transition from college star to NFL starter will be managed in a way that protects everyone involved. These plans are made with good intentions. They are made by smart people who have studied the history of quarterback development and who understand that the graveyard of NFL careers is full of talented players who were thrown into situations too early, before they were ready, before the pieces around them were in place, before the game had slowed down enough in their minds to allow them to perform at the level their talent demanded. But sometimes the player does not read the plan. Sometimes the player shows up and performs in ways that make the plan irrelevant. Sometimes the quarterback battle that was supposed to be a formality, that was supposed to produce a predetermined outcome, becomes something else entirely, something real, something competitive, something that forces the people holding the clipboard and making the decisions to confront the possibility that what they planned and what is actually happening are two very different things. That is the story of what is happening inside the Cleveland Browns right now. And the name at the center of it, the player who was supposed to wait, who was supposed to be patient, who was supposed to trust the process and accept the timeline and take his reps when they were given to him, has refused to do any of that. Not through defiance, not through complaints or demands or locker room politics, through performance, through the undeniable, unignorable, impossible to explain away language of a quarterback who is simply better than what the depth chart says he should be right now. To understand how we arrived at this moment, you have to go back to the beginning of the Browns' most recent attempt to solve the quarterback problem that has haunted this franchise for generations. The Deshaun Watson era, expensive, painful, and ultimately fruitless, had left Cleveland in a position that required a complete rethinking of how they were going to approach the most important position in football. The draft capital spent, the guaranteed money committed, the years lost to injury and suspension, all of it had to be reckoned with, and the reckoning produced a new approach, a new philosophy, a commitment to finding a quarterback through the draft, developing that player properly, and building a sustainable foundation rather than swinging for the fences one more time on a veteran solution that might or might not work. The 2025 NFL Draft was the first major expression of that new philosophy, and the selection the Browns made, the quarterback they brought into the building, arrived with a college resume that was historically decorated, with a reputation for football intelligence and competitive fire that preceded him, and with a chip on his shoulder that had been placed there by everyone who had ever looked at his measurables and decided that what they saw on paper was more important than what they saw on the field. He had been doubted at every level. He had responded at every level. And now he was in Cleveland, wearing orange and brown, and the doubts were already forming again before he had even put on the pads. The organization's plan, as it was communicated publicly and as it leaked through the various channels that NFL information always finds its way through, was conservative, measured, responsible. The rookie would learn. He would absorb the playbook. He would take his reps in practice and in preseason situations, and the organization would evaluate over time, and the decision about when he was ready to start would be made on a timeline that served his long-term development rather than the short-term demands of a fan base hungry for a reason to believe. This is standard operating procedure for NFL teams with young quarterbacks. It is the responsible approach. It is also, in Cleveland, an approach that has never once produced the franchise quarterback this city has been searching for. What happened next was not part of the plan. From the first full practice, from the very first time this quarterback stepped into the huddle with first-team reps and began operating within the Cleveland Browns offense, the people watching knew something was different. It was not one throw, it was not one play. It was the accumulation of moments, the pattern that emerged over days and then weeks, the growing body of evidence that this player was not operating like a rookie trying to find his footing. He was operating like someone who had already found it. The reads were quick, the decisions were clean, the ball was going where it needed to go, on time, with the kind of anticipatory accuracy that separates quarterbacks who understand football from quarterbacks who are merely talented at throwing it.
Coaches noticed. They could not help noticing. When you're running practices and evaluating players every single day, when your entire professional purpose is to assess talent and make decisions based on what you see, you cannot ignore what is in front of you. And what was in front of the Cleveland Browns coaching staff was a quarterback who was making their job harder in the best possible way by performing at a level that forced a genuine conversation about the timeline that had been established before he arrived. Veterans in the locker room noticed too. This matters more than people outside the building sometimes understand. When a young quarterback earns the respect of veteran players, not by being the general manager's pick or the coach's project, but by showing up every day and out-competing, by handling the mental demands of the position in a way that makes the people around him want to run through walls for him, something changes in the environment. The culture shifts. The belief begins to build. And that belief, once it starts spreading through a locker room, has a momentum that is very difficult to stop. The outside world began to catch up slowly. Practice reports, which are the breadcrumbs that the NFL media follows during the off-season and training camp periods, started reflecting what the people inside the building already knew. Reporters who were watching practice described a quarterback who was not just competing, but winning. Analysts who had spent months expressing reasonable skepticism about his ability to translate his college production to the professional level began to quietly update their assessments. The language shifted from cautious to intrigued, from intrigued to impressed, from impressed to something harder to contain. Social media, which has become the most immediate and least filtered barometer of public perception in modern sports, caught fire. Clips from practice, the kind of informal footage that finds its way out of training camp through phones and cameras, and the general impossibility of keeping anything completely private in the age of the internet, began circulating. Each clip added to the story. Each completed pass in a one-on-one drill, each perfect ball dropped into a tight window in a team period, each moment of poise in a situation designed to test a young quarterback's composure. All of it was being cataloged and shared and argued over by a fan base that had been waiting for exactly this kind of reason to feel something. The debate that exploded in the wake of these developments was not simply about football. In Cleveland, it never is. The quarterback debate in Cleveland carries emotional weight that has been accumulated over decades of searching and hoping and being let down. Every new quarterback who shows genuine promise in that building is both a football player and a vessel for everything the city has been waiting for. The people arguing online about whether this rookie should be starting were not just talking about depth charts, they were talking about hope, about whether it was safe to believe again, about whether this time, this player, this moment, this convergence of talent and opportunity and organizational commitment was actually different from all the times before when it had turned out not to be. The coaching staff was caught in the middle of something they had not fully anticipated.
The plan they had made, the careful, measured, responsible plan about quarterback development and timelines, was being challenged not by outside pressure or fan demands, but by the player himself. You cannot hold a player back from a starting role by pointing to a plan when the plan's entire premise was that the player needed time to develop, and the player is demonstrating visibly and repeatedly that he does not need the amount of time you thought he would. The argument for keeping him off the field weakens with every practice. The argument for putting him on the field strengthens with every throw.
There were voices inside the building, according to sources familiar with the situation, who were pushing for an accelerated timeline. Coaches who worked closely with him in daily practice, who had the most granular view of his development and his readiness, who were seeing things in the film room and on the practice field that made them believers. These voices were in conversation with other voices, more cautious voices, voices mindful of what had happened to other young quarterbacks in Cleveland and elsewhere when they were pushed into starting roles before the full support structure was in place, and the tension between these perspectives was real. It was the kind of healthy organizational tension that Andrew Berry had pushed back against the media for characterizing as dysfunction, but it was also unmistakably present. The preseason games became a referendum. Every snap this quarterback took in a preseason setting was watched with a level of intensity that preseason snaps almost never receive. The results were not perfect. Preseason never is, and expecting perfection from a rookie quarterback against professional defenses in his first live game action would have been unreasonable regardless of how well he had practiced. But the things that could not be faked, the processing speed, the pocket presence, the ability to go through a progression and find the open receiver rather than locking onto the first read, the calmness under pressure that separates quarterbacks who can survive at this level from those who cannot, those things were there, consistently, in ways that were hard to dismiss. The Browns' fan base, which had been patient in the way that only a fan base conditioned by years of disappointment can be patient, began to lose its patience with the managed narrative. The organization's careful messaging about development timelines and doing what was best for the player's long-term career was being met with a fan base that had heard careful messaging before, that had been told to trust the process before, that had watched careful plans produce careful mediocrity for longer than anyone wanted to remember. They had seen what they had seen in practice reports and preseason clips and in the energy building around this player, and they wanted to know why the organization seemed to be the last ones in Cleveland to catch up to what everyone else already understood. The media pressure intensified. Beat reporters who covered the team daily were asking sharper questions in press conferences. National voices who had been paying attention to the Browns situation were weighing in with takes that ranged from supportive to scathing. Former NFL quarterbacks, people who had been through quarterback competitions themselves, who understood the internal politics of depth chart decisions from the inside, were speaking with unusual directness about what they saw happening in Cleveland and what they thought should happen next. The consensus forming outside the building was not subtle. It was not nuanced. It was, this player is ready. The organization knows he is ready, and the only question is whether the people making the decisions are going to trust what is right in front of them, or whether they are going to protect a plan that the player himself has already made obsolete. Inside the building, the quarterback at the center of all of this kept doing what he had always done. He prepared, he studied, he came to work earlier than anyone expected and stayed later than anyone required. He built relationships with his receivers, with his offensive linemen, with the veterans who had seen young quarterbacks come and go, and who were forming opinions about this one based on what they observed up close rather than what they read online. He handled the uncertainty of his situation, the depth chart conversations he was not fully privy to, the organizational discussions happening above his head about his own future, with a maturity that people around him repeatedly commented on. He did not demand answers. He did not create drama. He made the answer obvious through his performance and then waited for the organization to arrive at the conclusion he had already reached about himself. The moment when the plan finally broke down entirely, when the careful management of the situation became impossible to maintain, came not from any single dramatic event, but from the accumulation of everything that had happened before it. There was no blow-up, no confrontation, no leaked report about a player demanding a meeting or a coach drawing a line in the sand. There was just the weight of evidence, piled up over weeks of practice and preseason games and honest conversations in film rooms, becoming too heavy for any alternative narrative to support. The player had taken over the quarterback battle. Not technically, not officially, not according to any depth chart that had been publicly released, but in the only way that ultimately matters in professional football, which is in the minds and beliefs of the people inside the building who know what they see. When the announcement came, when the Browns made the decision that the fan base had been demanding and the evidence had been supporting, the reaction was everything you would expect from a city that had been waiting for a moment like this for longer than it should have had to wait. Relief, excitement, the kind of cautious, hard-won optimism that Cleveland sports fans have learned to feel carefully because they know from experience that hope in Cleveland can be taken away without warning. But underneath the caution was something real, something that had been building since the first practice report said what it said, and the first preseason clip went viral, and the first veteran in that locker room told a reporter with something approaching genuine feeling that this one was different.
The quarterback battle in Cleveland was over. The player who had been held back had taken over, and the NFL was watching to see what would happen next. In a city that has rewritten its relationship with hope and heartbreak more times than anyone can count, what is happening with the Cleveland Browns quarterback situation feels different. Not because anyone has promised it will be different, not because the organization has done anything to guarantee a different outcome, but because the player at the center of it earned his position on merit, in competition, in the only language that football understands. They tried to hold him back. He took over. And now, the real story, the one that gets written on Sundays under the lights with everything on the line, is just beginning.